This is the history of Google, otherwise known as Alphabet, one of the biggest successes of the internet era, and perhaps one of the greatest business models ever devised in history. It all began on a warm evening in 1995, when a Stanford campus tour guide named Sergey Brin met a prospective grad student named Larry Page. They argued, genially but intensely, about everything: data sets and graph theory, the shape of the growing webs, where knowledge hides. The clash was friction that made a spark. Page had an engineer's itch about the then chaotic internet. If the web is a mesh of hyperlinks, citations in everything but name, could you measure the importance of a page by the pattern of links pointing to it? Brin, a mathematician with a taste for probability and playful proofs, liked the question. They began collecting answers. They called their first crawler backrub, as in, it read backlinks, the web's back where the quiet endorsements lived, and used those to score reputation. It was more than clever. It was a philosophical bet that authority could be inferred from the structure of conversation itself. The algorithm would become PageRank, a pun on Page's last name, but also a manifesto. By 1997, the prototype worked well enough to sit on Stanford servers under the plain domain name google.stanford.edu. Its austere homepage a wink at the academic roots of the whole thing. The idea, relevance distilled from the web's connective tissue, was audacious and strangely obvious once you saw it. It's what great ideas feel like in retrospect. Larry Page had arrived at Stanford by way of a Michigan childhood in a home where computers were not furniture, but family. His father, Carl Page, was a pioneering computer science professor. His mother, Gloria, taught programming. Larry learned to tinker young and to adopt a certain allergy to can't be done. He once described his house as a small laboratory, parts on tables, code on screens, and a kind of ambient expectation that tools should bend to imagination. Sergey Brin's story began in Moscow. His family emigrated to the United States when he was 6. His parents were mathematicians. His childhood was a bilingual equation in curiosity and adaptation. If Page brought a structuralist fascination with systems, Brin brought a probablist's delight in ambiguity. In grad school, they formed a partnership that often felt like a debate team that never adjourned, Larry asking, "How far can we push this system?" Sergey replying, "What does the distribution of errors look like if we do?" Their fights were physics, their agreements were products. Backrub began as a grad student hack with global ambition. PageRank, its brain, treated the web's link graph like a hall full of scholars. A link from a reputable page counted more than a link from an unknown one. Iterated over the entire web, the importance vector emerged from the noise. Their insight rested on a second belief. The web contained its own map, if only you listened to it. Crawling, indexing, ranking, these would be the instruments in a kind of information seismology. The first index lived on borrowed servers and charity. It sprawled. Every time Page turned the crawler loose, it returned with a bigger appetite. In a notebook, he sketched block diagrams for sharding, distributing the workload across cheap machines. The choice of cheap wasn't aesthetic. Money was scarce. It forged a habit that would survive prosperity. Build on commodity parts, assume failure, design for recovery. Still, the project needed money to keep functioning. And yet, venture capitalists passed. Web search and web portal companies, of which there were about a dozen at the time, looked at search as a problem that had largely been solved. Then, one morning in 1998, Andy Bechtolsheim, Sun Microsystems co-founder, investor, Silicon Valley eminence, stopped by a Menlo Park garage the duo had rented from a friend, Susan Wojcicki, and took a quick demo in the driveway. He didn't need a formal meeting. He needed a checkbook. He wrote a $100,000 check to Google Inc., which was problematic because the company did not yet exist. The joke writes itself. If the check says you're a company, you go incorporate, so they did. Around the check crystallized a small angel round, a few advisors, a name whose origins would be retold, a misspelling of Google, a nod to scale, and a near-religious commitment to speed and purity in search. Traffic surged from 10,000 queries a day to hundreds of thousands. The prototype outperformed incumbents on the one task users actually cared about, finding the thing they meant, not merely the string they typed. The results seemed to anticipate intention. They also carried a dogma. No pop-ups, no gaudy banners. Nothing that couldn't be justified by usefulness. This became Google's aesthetic. Opinionated simplicity masking complicated machinery. The home page's white emptiness was not minimalism for its own sake. It was a technical boast that the answer should arrive before your attention wandered. In the garage and the early Palo Alto office, the company set its social grammar. There were scooters and lava lamps, yes, but also end-to-end tests for the crawler, an indexing pipeline, hacky alerting systems that pinged pages at 3 a.m, and a hallway culture that treated the most junior engineers' data as trump over any executive's hunch. New recruits absorbed a norm. Articulate your conviction, then attach a graph. By mid-1999, the little engine needed serious money. Two Sand Hill Road heavyweights, John Doerr of Kleiner Perkins and Michael Moritz of Sequoia Capital, did something unusual. Co-lead a $25 million investment. The round put adult supervision on the cap table and something else inside the culture. Doerr brought with him a managerial instrument forged at Intel under Andy Grove, Objectives and Key Results. OKRS fit Google like a spine. They offered a way to give madcap ambition a calendar and a scoreboard without dulling the edges. If Google was going to index all the world's information, it would need the discipline to ship week after week. OKRS also gave the place a cadence. Engineers wrote quarterly objectives like mini manifestos. Reduce average query latency by 35%. Increase index freshness to under X hours for top Y% of queries. Prototype news clustering for breaking events. Each came with key results that could be measured. The genius wasn't in hitting 100%. In fact, you weren't supposed to. You aimed high, hit 0.6 to 0.7, learned, and reset. It created a culture comfortable with ambition and with the ritual of missing without failing. But this was not a culture, at least not yet. That was simpatico with a business plane. Most search engines at the time were supported by advertising. Then reality intervened. The dot-com froth that inflated search competitors' valuations also masked a hard question. How do you pay for petabytes of crawling and indexing if you won't charge users? Google found a solution that would end up becoming one of the biggest money printing machines ever conceived. And yet, they didn't find that solution on their own. Before Google turned search into a money machine, a handful of scrappy pioneers proved that intent-driven ads could work. In the mid-1990s, web portals sold banner ads on a CPM basis, rewarding page views rather than performance. It was noisy and inefficient. The big break came from Bill Gross's ideal venture GoTo.com, later Overture, which launched a radical idea in 1998. Sell search results themselves via an open, self-serve auction priced per click. Advertisers bid on keywords: mortgage, Las Vegas hotel, printer ink, and the ranking of sponsored links was determined by the bid. Crucially, the advertiser paid only when a user clicked. GoTo proved that matching a user's explicit query with performance-priced text ads could monetize commercial intent far better than display banners. The model spread quickly. Paid listings, clearly labelled, appeared atop or beside organic results across early search partners. Overture syndicated its ads to portals like Yahoo and MSN, building a network effect. Other experiments: OpenText's short-lived paid placement, 1996, LookSmart, Sprinks, sketched pieces of the puzzle, but Overture made the economics undeniable. The closer you are to the moment of intent, the more valuable each click. Google's founders initially resisted paid placement that distorted search rankings. In fact, Page and Brin had gone so far as to pen a student paper arguing that advertising-funded search engines were inherently conflicted. When Google launched AdWords in late 2000, it looked modest. Small, clearly separated text ads sold on a fixed monthly or CPM basis. The breakthrough came in 2002 with AdWords Select, which adopted a cost-per-click auction but added a crucial twist: relevance. Instead of simply awarding the top slot to the highest bidder, Google weighted bids by click-through rate and later a fuller quality score, effectively rewarding ads users actually found useful. The auction mechanics, a version of the generalized second price auction, aligned incentives. Advertisers wrote better, more relevant ads. Users got cleaner results. Google maximized revenue without trashing the search experience. Two things then scaled the flywheel. First, self-serve onboarding and real-time analytics made AdWords accessible to small businesses that had never bought national media. Second, Google pushed the model off its own property with AdSense, 2003, which contextually matched text ads to millions of partner pages and shared revenue with publishers. Suddenly, search intent and adjacent content intent were both monetized at massive scope. Overture sued Google for patent infringement in 2002. The case settled in 2004, with Google granting Yahoo, which had acquired Overture in 2003 stock and a license. By then, the market had spoken. Auctions plus CPC plus relevance were the winning stack. Throughout the 2000s, refinements, negative keywords, match types, conversion tracking, retargeting, and ever richer ad formats hardened the system into an operating standard for performance marketing. So while Google didn't invent paid search, it decisively recombined the elements. GoTo/Overture's CPC auction with Google's obsession for relevance and product polish into AdWords, the engine that funded everything from Gmail to Android. The modern idea economy runs on intent, and the road to it runs straight through those first keyword auctions. The monetization puzzle had another piece: AdSense. Contextual advertising, placing relevant ads on other publishers' pages, looked like an adjacent opportunity. In 2003 to 2004, Google acquired a small Santa Monica company called Applied Semantics, formerly Oingo, whose technology for understanding page meaning was the missing early ingredient. Overnight, the addressable web for Google's ad system expanded from google.com to the internet writ large. The revenue river that followed rewrote the company's destiny. If AdWords lit the engine, AdSense pressed the accelerator and helped the company outrun the dot-com bust that kneecapped so many peers. Omid Kordestani, a soft-spoken sales leader from browser pioneer Netscape, built a sales machine around this engineering heart. Sheryl Sandberg professionalized the global online sales and operations that would make the advertising flywheel spin at scale. The cultural trick was that sales could be discussed in the same breath as index freshness and server utilization, because it, too, was turned into a system problem whose solution lived in dashboards and experiments. It is not exaggeration in any way to say that Google set the cultural template for what a startup in the internet era should be. The mythology of early Google includes lava lamps and free food, but the more important myth is about failure and what the team did with it. In 2000, during delicate talks to power Yahoo search, Google's web crawling system stumbled. Freshness degraded, results went stale. A handful of engineers, Jeff Dean, Sanjay Gemawat, Craig Silverstein, went into the bunker. What they discovered in the machine room would define Google's style. The enemy was 1 part software and 1 part physics. Cheap commodity servers were flipping bits. Memory chips were flaking. The law of large numbers was revealing itself as the enemy of naive assumptions. Dean and Gamawat treated the hardware like weather. You couldn't stop the storms, so you designed umbrellas. They wrote code that assumed failure, and then they scaled that code like a philosophy. Out of that mindset came the Google File System, GFS, MapReduce, a programming model for splitting computation across thousands of machines, and Bigtable, a way to store data that flexed like rubber. These were not just internal tools. They were the secret scaffolding under everything else Google would do. Later, when the world discovered Hadoop, it was discovering open echoes of a private architecture that had already matured behind Google's walls. Urs Hölzel, a Swiss computer scientist with a surfer's demeanour and sandals to match, became the patron saint of the data centre. He pushed for efficiency as if watts were bugs. He evangelized PUE power usage effectiveness before it was fashionable, championed custom server designs that looked like IKEA furniture but ran like F1 cars, and hid whole shipping container-sized clusters behind anonymity. If Google's products looked like magic, Hölzel's empire was the stagecraft making the magic repeatable. By 2001, Google's growth required another compromise. The board, Doerr, Moritz, and the early angels, gently insisted on a seasoned CEO. The euphemism was adult supervision. Larry Page resisted, then relented. Eric Schmidt, a veteran of Sun and freshly minted CEO of Novell, interviewed, walked the campus, took in the lava lamps, and accepted the job. The arrangement was unusual, a triumvirate, with Schmidt as a kind of player coach. Page focused on product, Brin on special projects and research, Schmidt on scaling the company without calcifying it. The schema proved resilient. Don't be evil. A wisecrack shorthand for choose the user remained on the wall, and the engineers still had the final say in many arguments. But there were now budgets, roadmaps, hiring bars, and the beginnings of HR rigor. Schmidt did something else. he institutionalized Google's habit of arguing in public. Weekly TGIF All Hands were a forum where founders fielded raw questions and product leaders took unscripted heat. It built trust and a taste for internal dissent. The hallmark of the era was candor wrapped in data. If you brought a strong opinion, you also brought an experiment. But another part of Google's legendary culture was a penchant for side projects and employee-led exploration. After the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, the web fractured into a storm of headlines. Krishna Bharat, a research scientist at Google, built a system to cluster news articles from thousands of sources and to surface multiple perspectives on a single event. Google News launched as a kind of algorithmic editor, plural by design. It was a product born from an engineer's discomfort with a single narrative. It also foreshadowed a tension that would follow Google for years. When you curate at scale, even algorithmically, you are in the newsroom whether you admit it or not. Gmail began as Paul Buchheit's side project, an email client built inside a browser that behaved like an app. The codename Caribou was a Dilbert joke turned totem. Buchheit obsessed over speed and searchability. Email, he argued, shouldn't be a broom closet you periodically swept. It should be a searchable archive of your working life. On April Fool's Day, April 1st, 2004, Google unveiled Gmail with a single implausible promise: 1 gigabyte of free storage, some 500 times industry norms, plus lightning search and threaded conversations. People thought it was a prank. It was not. The invitation-only rollout created a black market for invites and a generation of users who learned that email could be something you never had to delete. Gmail's interface popularized what would soon be called AJAX, pages that behaved like software. The web itself felt different after it. Inside Google, Gmail validated 2 hunches: that 20% time could birth core products, and that if you reframed an old category around a Google native advantage, search, you could change user behavior overnight. By this point, Google was solidly profitable, though it would soon shock the world by the degree to which this was so. When Google filed to go public on April 29th, 2004, it did so on its own terms. The S1 included a founder letter, an owner's manual for Google shareholders, promising a long-term focus, a willingness to make unconventional bets, and the much-quoted "don't be evil." The company adopted a dual-class share structure to keep strategic control with insiders, and in a break with Wall Street ritual, it chose a modified Dutch auction to allocate shares, an attempt to let everyday investors set the price rather than a handful of institutions. The run-up was bumpy. Demand proved hard to read. Google cut the offer size and lowered expectations. A glossy Playboy interview with Page and Brin, published during the SEC quiet period, forced an awkward amendment to the filing. Critics groused about secrecy and governance. Fans argued the business fundamentals were overwhelming. On August 19th, 2004, Google priced at $85 a share, raising roughly $1.67 billion and debuting at a market value near $23 billion. The stock opened above the offer and closed over $100, a quiet confirmation. In 4 short years, a Stanford research project had become a public company with a durable business model, intent-driven advertising that would bankroll a generation of bets from Gmail and Maps to Android and beyond. The IPO didn't change Google. It simply gave rocket fuel to what it already was. If the web was the terrain, search was the compass. But by the mid-2000s, the map itself was changing. Google's answer was to build new compasses and claim more of the terrain. And suddenly, for the first time, advances in bandwidth and technology meant that an increasing part of the web's terrain was video. YouTube's story starts with 3 PayPal alumni, Chad Hurley, Steve Chen, and Jawed Karim, who in early 2005 were frustrated by how hard it was to share video online. The web was full of codec headaches and broken downloads. Most people simply couldn't get a clip to play on another person's computer. The trio registered YouTube.com on February 14th, 2005, and began with a loose idea, famously described by some founders as a video dating site, by Karim as a place to find clips like the 2004 Super Bowl wardrobe malfunction and tsunami footage. Whatever the origin story, the real insight arrived quickly. Make it dead simple for anyone to upload anything, convert it automatically to a single format, play it instantly in the browser, and let people paste the video anywhere with a one-line embed. Technically, that meant server-side transcoding to flash video, so playback just worked, plus a lightweight player that loaded fast on average PCs. Socially, it meant leaning into comments, ratings, and crucially the embed code, so videos could ride the growth of blogs and MySpace profiles. In April 2005, Karim posted Me at the Zoo, the first upload. By that summer, home videos, prank clips, and early vlogs were flying around the web. The site's frictionless publishing and viral distribution created a positive feedback loop. Creators showed up because the audience was there. The audience showed up because creators were there. Sequoia Capital backed the company, first with a seed led by Roelof Botha, then a larger round as usage exploded, giving the tiny team the bandwidth to keep up with growth. By late 2005 and into 2006, breakout moments, Lazy Sunday, early music videos, and news snippets made YouTube a staple of online culture. It wasn't that these clips couldn't be found elsewhere, they simply couldn't be found, played, and shared as easily. Meanwhile, Google's own product, Google Video, struggled under heavier workflows and a less vibrant community. But YouTube's rocket ride came with a legal shadow. A non-trivial portion of its most popular content was copyrighted, music videos, TV sketches, sports highlights, uploaded by users without permission. The Digital Millennium Copyright Act, DMCA, offered safe harbour if a platform responded expeditiously to takedown notices and adopted a repeat infringer policy. YouTube complied, removing flagged content, yet rights holders argued the company benefited from infringement. Lawsuits and threats loomed, and bandwidth bills mounted, even as YouTube had little revenue. In October 2006, Google agreed to buy YouTube for $1.65 billion in stock. The deal was instantly controversial. Skeptics said Google was admitting defeat on Google Video, paying a massive premium for a company with no profits and a bullseye on its back. Media companies worried Google would use search dominance to funnel traffic to a site built on their material. Shareholders asked why a search company was buying a legal headache. Google addressed the risk on multiple fronts. First, it embraced the DMCA framework, betting that courts would uphold safe harbour for platforms that took takedowns seriously. A bet that, after years of litigation, most notably Viacom versus YouTube, proved sound. Second, Google hurried to sign licensing and revenue sharing deals. On the day the acquisition was announced, YouTube unveiled partnerships with major media owners, CBS, Warner Music, Universal, later others, signalling a shift from adversarial takedowns to monetized distribution. Third, Google invested in a technical solution. What became Content ID launched in 2007, a fingerprinting system that let rights holders claim uploads automatically, block them, or run ads and share the revenue. That turned copyright from a binary in or out question into a configurable business model. Culturally, Google kept YouTube semi-autonomous in San Bruno, preserving the product's community feel while layering in policies, ad systems, and global infrastructure. The combination of legal compliance, DMCA procedures, repeat infringer policies, commercial alignment, content deals and partner programs, and technology, Content ID, diffused much of the initial controversy. In hindsight, the acquisition looks obvious. Google bought the internet's default video layer, then made it legitimate and sustainable. At the time, though, it took conviction, both that user-generated video would be the future of media, and that the law and technology would evolve to meet it. YouTube also taught Google to live with a product that was as much a culture as a tool. The power users weren't enterprise customers or casual emailers. They were creators, a new professional class whose livelihoods depended on the platform's algorithmic weather. In time, the company learned to speak creator as fluently as it spoke advertiser. Google Maps began far from Mountain View. In 2003, Danish brothers Lars and Jens Eilstrup Rasmussen and colleague Noel Gordon were building a desktop mapping application in Sydney under a startup called Where2 Technologies. The idea was powerful, but the medium was wrong. Downloadable software felt clunky just as the web was getting faster and more interactive. After Google acquired Where2 in 2004, the team reframed the product as a browser experience. That pivot, drag a map smoothly in any direction, fetch tiles invisibly in the background, became the signature slippy map interface that made web maps feel like paper maps you could push around with a mouse. Technically, it was a small revolution. Maps were sliced into 256 by 256 pixel tiles, fetched on demand with asynchronous JavaScript, the AJAX pattern Google popularized at the time. Rather than waiting for a whole page to reload after each pan or zoom, the map glided as tiles stitched in under the cursor. This responsiveness turned cartography into an interface you could play with. Early Google product leaders and engineers, Brett Taylor among them, pushed to make the default experience fast, minimal, and instantly useful. A search box, a clean map, directions that made sense. A trio of acquisitions in 2004 to 2005 gave Maps its superpowers. Keyhole, a startup led by John Hankey, brought globe-spanning satellite imagery. Soon branded Google Earth, and within Maps, the satellite button. ZipDash contributed traffic intelligence. Meanwhile, licensing deals with TeleAtlas and NavTQ supplied the base road data in the US and Europe. When Google launched Maps publicly in February 2005, it felt different from MapQuest or Yahoo Maps. Less like a form you filled out, more like a world you could explore. Two decisions lit the growth fuse. First, Google joined local search to the map. Queries like coffee in Soho returned pins and phone numbers, not blue links and guesswork. Second, after developer Paul Rademacher famously hacked early maps to create housing maps, overlaying Craigslist rentals on the map, Google embraced the impulse and launched the official Google Maps API in mid-2005. That opened the door to the mashup era, real estate, crime maps, transit visualizations, turning maps into a platform as much as a product. Then came the world at street level. In 2007, Google introduced Street View, initially in a handful of US cities. Camera-equipped cars, and later trikes and backpacks, stitched billions of panoramas into a navigable layer. Controversial at launch for privacy reasons, Street View nonetheless became a defining feature. You could virtually stand in front of a storefront before driving there. On mobile, a Java app in 2006 gave way to native apps. My Location, cell tower, Wi-Fi triangulation, arrived in 2007, and in 2009, free turn-by-turn navigation on Android shocked the GPS industry and pulled maps from Planning Tool to Daily Companion. Street View began as a moonshot with earthly logistics. Cars with camera masts fanned out, stitching together panoramic images of the world's public roads. It was a staggering data engineering problem. Petabytes of images, anonymization that could blur faces and license plates on the fly, pipelines to ingest, correct, and serve. Along the way, the project ran into human law. In Germany and elsewhere, residents saw a camera on a curb as surveillance. Regulators launched inquiries. In one chapter, a misguided Wi-Fi data collection practice resulted in fines and apologies. Street View survived because it kept proving how useful it was. Litigators used it to establish facts. Urban planners used it to study neighbourhoods. Everyday users used it to figure out which door was the right one. The deeper lesson was about legitimacy. A product at world scale is not just a spreadsheet of metrics. It's a negotiation with norms. The camera car could be a villain or a librarian depending on how the story was told and who controlled the narrative. Behind the scenes, Google steadily replaced licensed assets with its own data, collecting street names and business details with human operators, ingesting user reports, and later using machine learning on imagery to extract features like addresses and speed limits. The company also pushed mapping to the long tail, opening MapMaker, 2008, to let volunteers edit roads and place names in undermapped regions, then folded those capabilities into its internal pipelines. Each layer made maps more accurate, more global, and more alive. By the early 2010s, vector rendering replaced bitmap tiles on mobile, unlocking buttery zoom, rotation, and 3D buildings while reducing data use. Partnerships added transit schedules, bike routes, and indoor maps of airports and malls. And in 2013, Google bought Waze, whose community incident reports improved real-time routing, merging human sensors with algorithmic prediction. What began as a clever interface for panning a map became an operating system for the physical world. Local search, navigation, imagery, real-time traffic, place identity, and a developer platform used by millions of apps. The creation of Google Maps was less a single launch than a compounding strategy. Start with a delightful core interaction, then layer data, imagery, and openness until the map isn't just a picture of the world, but a live model of it. Inside, Maps became another proving ground for Google's ability to blend machine learning with human curation. Millions of edits a day from users, algorithms that guessed addresses in countries with no standard addressing, business owners claiming pins like homesteads. The map was never done. It was a living database stitched from satellites, phones, and the stubborn specificity of people who know which alley is one way after 5 p.m. Android began as a tiny startup with a broad ambition: build an operating system for pocketable computers. In 2003, Andy Rubin, ex-Danger, Rich Miner, Wildfire, Nick Sears, ex-T-Mobile, and Chris White founded Android Inc. The earliest pitch circled digital cameras, but the team quickly pivoted to phones, sensing that general-purpose handhelds would subsume dedicated devices. Their bet: a Linux-based open platform that handset makers and carriers could adopt without paying Microsoft-style license fees, and that developers could target without begging a single company for permission. Google bought Android in August 2005 for a reported approximately $50 million and kept the team semi-stealth within the company. Why Google? By 2005, the company already dominated desktop search, but it could see where usage was heading: mobile. If the front door to the internet moved to a device controlled by someone else, the owner of that device could decide which search box was default, which ads ran where, and what data Google could access. Buying Android wasn't about selling software, it was insurance on distribution. The pre-iPhone Android effort looked like a BlackBerry killer, a prototype called Sooner with a small screen, keyboard, and stylus-driven UI. Then January 2007 happened. Apple unveiled the iPhone, capacitive multi-touch, a big glass display, fluid scrolling, and instantly reset expectations for mobile computing. Inside Google, the reaction was swift and humbling. The team pivoted from a keyboard-centric layout to touch first, rethinking everything from rendering to input to power management. That pivot delayed timelines but avoided shipping something obsolete on day one. Google announced Android publicly in November 2007 alongside the Open Handset Alliance, HTC, Motorola, Samsung, LG, Qualcomm, TI, carriers like T-Mobile, Sprint, and more. The message was strategic. Android wasn't Google's phone. It was a free, open platform any OEM could use, with Google's apps and services available if you adopted the Google Mobile Services bundle, Gmail, Maps, YouTube, Play Market, and critically, Google Search as default. This framework aligned incentives. OEMs got a modern OS and an app ecosystem without paying a license. Carriers got customizability. Developers got a huge potential market, and Google protected the search box. The first handset, HTC Dream T-Mobile G1, arrived in October 2008. A quirky, lovable slider with a resistive-era scroll ball trying to live in a touch world. It lacked multi-touch gestures at launch and felt rough next to the iPhone, but it had two superpowers: a real web browser with Google services built in, and, equally important, an open, rapidly improving platform. Android Market, later Google Play, made it easy to distribute apps. Frequent OS releases, Cupcake, Donut, Eclair, Froyo, added features at a pace Apple's annual cadence made look glacial. OEMS embraced Android to answer the iPhone without ceding control to Microsoft. Carriers loved that they could preload their own apps and stores. Consumers got variety and price competition. Strategically, Android let Google do three things it could never guarantee on someone else's platform. 1. Control distribution of search and ads. The default search box is one of the highest value real estate decisions in tech. With Android, Google could enshrine its own search and later its mobile ad stack and analytics. Even when Google paid partners or shared revenue for defaults, it was doing so inside an ecosystem it shaped. 2. Preserve data and telemetry, search quality, maps routing, and ad targeting all improve with usage data. Platform ownership meant Google could lawfully collect signals with user permissions and iterate quickly on products like Maps navigation, free turn by turn on Android in 2009, a move that kneecapped standalone GPS vendors and made Android phones indispensable. 3. Prevent platform lockout. If Apple chose Bing, or if Microsoft/Nokia regained momentum, Google's core cash cow, intent-driven advertising, could be squeezed at the entry point. Android ensured a massive installed base where Google wasn't a guest but the landlord. The iPhone forced Android to raise its UX game, but Android forced the smartphone market to diversify. As OEMs like Samsung, HTC, and Motorola shipped dozens of models across price tiers, Android's share surged. Google complemented the platform with strategic moves, acquiring AdMob, announced 2009, closed 2010, to accelerate mobile ads, investing heavily in maps, free navigation, Street View, to make Android uniquely useful on the go, launching Nexus and later Pixel devices to set a benchmark for how Android should look and perform. Of course, the open strategy came with trade-offs, fragmentation across screen sizes and OS versions, OEM skins that diverged from Google's design, and the constant negotiation with carriers over updates and preloads. Google responded by tightening the Google Mobile Services Agreement, shifting key innovations into updatable apps and Play services, and using flagship devices to pull the ecosystem forward. In hindsight, Android looks inevitable, but in 2005 to 2010, it was a high-stakes hedge. Google's core business was, and is, selling highly targeted ads against user intent. If the smartphone era put a gatekeeper between users and the open web, that gatekeeper could tax, throttle, or replace Google at the moment of intent. Android removed that existential risk. It converted mobile from a threat to an amplifier, expanding search volume, unlocking location-aware queries, and birthing entire categories of commercial activity that flow through Google's ad and payments rails. The payoff wasn't OS license revenue. It was protecting and expanding the engine that funds everything from YouTube to cloud to moonshots. Android, in other words, was Google's way of making sure the future of computing still had a Google button at the centre. The collision with Apple was violent. In the earliest iPhone days, Google was everywhere on Apple's device. Maps, search, YouTube pre-installed. Then platforms diverged. Steve Jobs called Android a stolen product. Lawsuits flew. The thermonuclear rhetoric left scorch marks even as both platforms thrived. In 2012, Apple replaced Google's Maps with its own. The launch stumbled, and Google's standalone iOS Maps app became a smash. Eric Schmidt left Apple's board in 2009 under pressure as Android and iOS collided. The truce turned into a cold war of defaults and developer mindshare. Google won reach through Android's global scale. Apple won profit through vertical control. Their rivalry set the bookends for the mobile era. Android's internal arc was its own drama. Andy Rubin, Android's original champion, ran the division like a startup inside the mothership. In 2013, Sundar Pichai, already the shepherd of Chrome, took over Android as well, unifying the web runtime and the mobile operating system under one leader. It brought a coherence to Google's platform strategy. The browser and the phone were not separate kingdoms. They were layers of the same bet on the open web. Also in 2008, Google launched Chrome. Google built Chrome because the web was turning into an application platform and existing browsers buckled under heavier pages. Around 2006 to 2007, a small team led by Sundar Pichai and Linus Upson, with veterans like Ben Goodger and Darren Fisher, set 3 non-negotiables: speed, stability, and security. Their bold idea was to treat each tab like its own mini-app. Chrome launched in September 2008 with a multi-process architecture and sandboxing, so a crash in one tab wouldn't topple the whole browser. And malicious code would have a much harder time escaping the page. Chrome's argument was simple. The browser should be fast and stable enough to behave like an operating system for the web. Over time, it did more than that. It became a distribution channel for search defaults, a standards-pushing cudgel, and, for rivals, a reason to worry about one company shaping the runtime of the modern web. Under the hood, Chrome paired the WebKit rendering engine with a brand new JavaScript engine, V8, built in Denmark by Lars Bach's team. V8 used just-in-time compilation and smart object representations to make web apps feel snappy compared to the era's norm. Up top, Chrome simplified the Chrome itself. The Omnibox merged URL and search box. Tabs lived at the very top, preferences were minimal, and auto-updates, Omaha, quietly kept everything current. It also shipped incognito for private sessions and a task manager to show which tab or extension ate your RAM. Developers were central from day one. After launch on Windows, Mac and Linux followed. Google added an extensions platform, 2009, and then the Chrome Web Store, 2010, giving the browser its own lightweight app ecosystem. The team pushed web capabilities forward, first with experiments like Google Gears, then with standards work, and even proposed SPDY, a faster transport that influenced HTTP/2. Chrome's rapid release cycle, 6 weeks, kept features and security fixes flowing far faster than legacy browsers. As share climbed, Chrome's ambitions grew. It powered Chrome OS laptops, and, in 2013, Google forked WebKit to create Blink, allowing faster iteration on the rendering engine itself. The through line never changed. Make the browser an efficient, safe runtime for modern applications. By relentlessly optimizing speed, isolating failure, and hiding complexity behind auto-updates, Chrome turned the browser from a fragile document viewer into the default operating environment for the web. The bet echoed Google's oldest instinct. When in doubt, put more of the world into the cloud, then make the client lighter. Behind these products was an infrastructure vision that treated data centers like living organisms. MapReduce made it trivial to parallelize massive computations. Bigtable let dozens of products store and retrieve data flexibly at petabyte scale. Borg, an internal cluster manager, scheduled workloads across fleets with a ruthlessness that felt like physics. Chubby provided distributed locking. Colossus, GFS's successor, lifted ceilings. Dremel made interactive analysis of giant datasets feel like a spreadsheet. Externally, its spirit showed up in BigQuery. Externally, their ideas escaped into the world. Hadoop in the open source community. Later, Kubernetes, Google's elegant retelling of Borg's lessons, became the lingua franca of cloud computing. As headcount climbed through the thousands, Google tried to keep weird on the menu. Nooglers wore propeller beanies at orientation. Micro kitchens gave birth to the Google 15. Brain teaser interview questions became urban legend. Over time, the company retired the gimmicks and hardened the process around structured interviews, peer-calibrated ratings, and a ruthless emphasis on googliness, a catch-all for curiosity, humility, and a bias toward action. Marissa Mayer, one of the earliest product managers, became the face of a new kind of PM, equal parts designer and analyst, obsessed with pixels and p-values. A /B testing, the idea that you let the data arbitrate aesthetic disputes, became a cultural norm. It could be maddening, 50 shades of blue in a famous debate over link colour, and liberating, ship, measure, iterate at once. The money poured in. AdWords became Google's mint. AdSense turned publishers into distributors. But power is the twin of money, and power keeps score in other arenas. The company felt Facebook as a gravitational field it didn't control. It tried to fight physics. Google's curiosity about social software predated Facebook's dominance. Blogger, acquired in 2003, helped democratize publishing. Orkut, launched in 2004, became a cultural phenomenon in Brazil and India. An early hint that the centre of gravity of social media might not be in Silicon Valley's backyard. Wave, in 2009, was a techno-utopian collaboration tool that tried to fuse documents, chat, and version history into a single canvas. Knoll, a 2008 experiment, tried to coax experts into writing authoritative entries under their own bylines, a kind of paid counter-Wikipedia that never found its rhythm. These were not failures so much as drafts. Wave's operational transforms, a mathy way to let multiple people edit simultaneously without conflicts, escaped into Google Docs, which quietly became the default word processor of the internet. Bloggers' DNA fed the creator economy that would later bloom on YouTube. Orkut taught internationalization at a depth that mere translation never could. In 2011 arrived Google+, more ambitious, with circles and a cross-company mandate to add a social layer to everything. Engineers built, executives cajoled teams to integrate, users shrugged. The lesson was painful. You don't will a social graph into existence by decree. In the end, Plus became an organ the body rejected. Google+, the most ambitious of the social gambits, is remembered mostly for its failure to dislodge Facebook. Internally, it taught a sterner lesson. Cohesion by mandate. Put a social layer on everything doesn't create community, it creates resentment. After Plus, Google rediscovered its native axis. Not who you know, but what you want and what you're trying to do. The attempt wasn't wasted, however. Pieces of Plus, identity, photos, and Hangouts, evolved into strong, standalone products. But as a frontal assault on Facebook, it was a misread. Google's native superpower had always been intent, not friendship. In 2011, Google announced it would acquire Motorola Mobility for $12.5 billion, a deal framed as a patent shield for Android, but also a hardware play. The experiment was brief. By 2014, Google sold Motorola to Lenovo, keeping a trove of patents and an education in the hard economics of phones. The company would return to hardware later under the Pixel brand, this time with a steadier hand and a more patient appetite for iteration. Google launched Google.cn in 2006 with a censored index, arguing that some information was better than none, and that transparency about what was missing could itself be a civic good. In 2010, after sophisticated cyber attacks and a reconsideration of values, Google redirected Chinese search to Hong Kong and effectively exited the mainland search market. The retreat was both moral stance and market concession. The world's largest internet would be organised mostly without Google. Google had always run the largest cloud in the world, its own. In 2008, it invited developers onto a sliver of that platform via App Engine. Over the next decade, it turned that toehold into Google Cloud Platform, and then Google Cloud, a business that married the raw horsepower of Google's infrastructure with enterprise software pragmatism. Diane Green, a founder of VMware, joined to give the effort enterprise credibility. Thomas Kurian later brought product discipline and a sales machine that looked customers in the eye. It took time. Enterprises moved slowly, and then, all at once, the pace shifted. Kubernetes, open sourced by Google in 2014, became the de facto standard for container orchestration, and BigQuery became the kind of database that felt like a superpower for analysts. By the early 2020s, Google Cloud had moved from rounding error to growth engine, and for the first time, a reliable profit center. The long bet on infrastructure and AI turned into a business with its own flywheel and its own culture. In 2015, Google reorganized itself under a holding company called Alphabet. Sundar Pichai, who had shepherded Chrome and then Android, became Google's CEO. The founders stepped up and then gradually aside. The new structure promised clarity. Moonshots and health bets and other skunk works could sit beside, rather than inside, Google the company. X, the Moonshot factory, incubated self-driving cars, Waymo, delivery drones, Wing, internet balloons, Loon, and more. Some graduated, some shut down. All bought the parent company options on wild futures. Waymo began as Google's self-driving car project in 2009, seeded inside Google X by roboticist Sebastian Thrun and early lead Chris Urmson. The team racked up miles in sensor-laden Toyota Priuses and later Lexus SUVs to prove that software could handle everyday driving, not just staged demos. Google went public about the effort in 2010 with a blog post laying out the safety rationale, reduce human error crashes, and reclaim time lost to traffic, which framed the moonshot's purpose for the next decade. A signature milestone came in 2015. Steve Mahan, who is legally blind, took the first fully autonomous ride on public streets, alone in Google's tiny Firefly prototype with no steering wheel or pedals, signalling that the stack could operate without a human babysitter. The moment became part of the company's origin myth, and later Waymo's launch reel. Commercialization accelerated when Alphabet spun the project out as Waymo in December 2016, naming auto veteran John Krafcik as CEO to take it from research to business. The new unit emphasized that it was building a driver that could be integrated into multiple vehicles, not a car brand. Partnerships followed. Fiat Chrysler would supply thousands of Pacifica hybrid minivans for ride-hail pilots. And Jaguar Land Rover agreed to provide up to 20,000 all-electric I-Pace SUVs, telegraphing ambitions to scale a premium all-EV fleet. The first paying product arrived in the Phoenix Metro. Waymo One launched in late 2018 and, by October 2020, opened fully driverless rides to members of the public in parts of Chandler, Tempe, and Mesa. No safety driver up front. Phoenix became the proving ground where the model of an autonomous, geo-fenced ride-hailing service moved from pilot to real business. Leadership changed in 2021 when Kravchik stepped down and the company appointed co-CEOs Takadra Mawakana, Business, Policy, and Dmitry Dolgov, Engineering. The move affirmed that the task ahead was equal parts technical and operational, expanding service areas, navigating regulators, and hardening safety systems while iterating the Waymo driver. California became the next big stage. In August 2023, Waymo won permission from the California Public Utilities Commission to charge fares for 24/7 driverless rides in San Francisco, a breakthrough after years of incremental permits. In March 2024, regulators approved expansion into Los Angeles and down the peninsula, allowing Waymo to begin rolling out paid service in LA after an initial free phase. These approvals, won amid vocal local skepticism, effectively anointed Waymo as the state's commercial robotaxi operator. Waymo also shifted distribution. In 2023, it partnered with Uber so Phoenix riders could hail a Waymo directly from the Uber app, later extending that model to other cities as coverage grew. The strategy lets Waymo stay a consumer brand via the Waymo One app, while tapping Uber's demand to fill cars, useful as the company scales into new neighborhoods. Safety scrutiny intensified in 2024. The US National Highway Traffic Safety Administration opened a probe into reports of Waymo vehicles colliding with stationary objects and exhibiting unexpected behaviours around traffic controls. A cyclist suffered minor injuries after a February 2024 collision with a driverless Waymo in San Francisco. In July 2025, NHTSA closed its 14-month investigation without further action, citing software updates and recalls Waymo had already implemented to address the issues. The episode underscored the regulatory reality of commercial autonomy. Investigations, over-the-air fixes, and continuous validation are part of operating at scale on public roads. These days, Waymo operates fully driverless, paid robo-taxi service across large parts of Phoenix, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, with additional service available via Uber in Austin and Atlanta. The company continues to expand its Bay Area footprint and LA coverage, and it regularly announces new mapping and pilot activities as it readies more markets. Waymo emphasizes that its fleet is fully electric and powered by renewable energy, and it publishes comparative safety data from its operating cities to argue that the Waymo driver crashes less severely and less often than the average human driver over the same mileage. Strategically, Waymo's approach has remained consistent since the spin-out. Prove reliability in constrained operational design domains, scale service areas street by street, partner with automakers, JLR, Stellantis, for vehicles, and grow demand through a mix of its own app and platforms like Uber. The long-run bet is that a generalized, licensable driver can unlock not only ride-hail, but also logistics and personal vehicle integrations. After rivals stumbled, most notably Cruise's late 2023 shutdown in California, Waymo's methodical cadence, regulatory wins, and visible ridership in multiple cities have left it the US category leader by active service. It's not victory so much as momentum. The more real, paid rides Waymo completes, the more data it feeds into training and validation, and the more political and consumer capital it accrues for the next expansion. That compounding loop, data, trust, territory, defines the company's current chapter. Waymo illustrates one way in which Google was an AI company from day one. Internally, the Google Brain project made neural networks practical at company scale. In 2014, Google bought DeepMind in London, a research lab that treated AI like a scientific frontier. The combined efforts produced scientific fireworks, AlphaGo's defeat of human champions, and, later, protein-folding breakthroughs that rewrote textbooks. The lab culture, half academia and half product shop, gave Google a pipeline of ideas and an intellectual brand that mattered to recruits. But Google was, in a way, perhaps the most consequential contributor to AI development in recent years. In 2017, a Google research paper introduced the transformer architecture with a title that felt like a dare. Attention is all you need. It turned out to be almost right. The transformer unlocked a wave of language and multimodal models that defined the 2020s. For a while, those models lived mostly in research, improving the guts of translation and photos and the back ends of ads. Tensor processing units, TPUs, Google's custom chips, gave the models a home optimized for linear algebra at an industrial scale. While headlines chased big demos, AI seeped into quotidian products. Search results learned to anticipate and summarize. Photos grouped faces and scenes with eerie accuracy. Android's on-device models transcribed speech and predicted text. The pixel line showed off a party trick a year, from magic eraser to call screening that felt like delegation. Duplex, the uncanny demo of an assistant booking a haircut by phone, hinted at an ambient future where the computer negotiated with the world on your behalf. The public's imagination snapped to attention with chat interfaces powered by large language models. For the first time in a long time, Google looked reactive, careful to a fault. Slower to launch a chatbot despite having the research pedigree. Inside, the company accelerated. Bard shipped and then, in 2024, was renamed Gemini, aligning the consumer product with the company's new family of large models. The research pedigree became product. Gemini's variants learned to summarize, to write, to plan. Google slid AI into Workspace, Search, and Android until it stopped feeling like a feature and more like a substrate. The move was not only aesthetic, it was commercial. The business end of AI lived in Google Cloud, where training and inference workloads turned data centers into AI factories. The bet was familiar. Build useful tools for developers, reduce the friction to use them, and make scale your ally. In parallel, the company grappled with safety, alignment, and the strange social impacts of putting word-predicting machines in people's pockets. The public story of Google is a pearl string of launches and acquisitions, but the more revealing story hides in the detours. The projects that died but left bones in the body. The experiments that looked frivolous and turned out to be forwards. The institutional habits that made the company both prolific and, at times, maddening. In 2007, Google bought DoubleClick, a foundational ad tech firm whose software stitched together the messy supply chain of online advertising. If AdWords was a pristine storefront, DoubleClick was the warehouse and the loading dock, the ad server, the relationships with publishers, the pipes through which creative assets travelled. The acquisition didn't merely add revenue, it fused Google's intent-driven ad machine to the display ad economy that financed much of the web's media. With it came cookies, frequency caps, attribution models, and a new level of scrutiny from regulators who worried that knowledge of what people wanted, search, plus knowledge of where they went, display, added up to a power too great for one company. From the outside, this period can read as monopoly math. From the inside, it felt like infrastructure debt paid down. With a DoubleClick in the fold, Google could simplify what had been a Rube Goldberg diagram of auction houses, exchanges, and networks. Products like Ad Manager and AdX tied together supply and demand. The act of buying attention began to look programmable at global scale. The language of the business shifted subtly too. Advertisers no longer just bought slots, they bought outcomes. And Google, alone among its peers, could sell intention, attention, and attribution in one continuous story. Privacy was the pinch point. As Europe sharpened GDPR and the US states began their own privacy regimes, Google learned a second institutional language, the conditional tense of compliance. Consent dialogues, transparency reports, retention schedules, DPIAS. These were as much product features as any pixel. The company was discovering that, at planetary scale, policy is UX by another name. Search itself evolved under constant fire. There were the obvious battles, spam farms, content scrapers, SEO gamesmanship, and then the subtle ones, where the definition of quality shifted under cultural feet. To keep pace, Google shipped waves of algorithm updates that acquired animal names and mythic reputations. Panda cracked down on low-quality content. Penguin went after manipulative link practices. Caffeine rebuilt the indexing infrastructure so that the web could be fresher. Hummingbird replumbed the engine to understand intent and semantics more naturally. RankBrain, and later a family of neural ranking systems, tucked machine learning into the scoring function. Outwardly, these were named storms. Inwardly, they were evidence of a principle. Your map is only as good as your critics. Webmasters fumed, SEOs reverse engineered, and users kept typing. The goal was irreducible: surface the thing someone meant. The method increasingly looked like modelling language itself, rather than just counting signals. When the knowledge graph arrived in 2012, a web of entities and edges that let Google answer the question, not just point to a page that might, search grew a second brain. The right-hand panels and direct answers were flashy. The deeper shift was conceptual. The index had been a library. The graph made it a guide. AMP landed with more controversy. The Accelerated Mobile Pages project offered near-instant loading for news and other content, but publishers worried about ceding too much control to a format Google privileged. Even inside, the debate was intense. How much should speed be enforced by a template as opposed to taught by incentives? The project evolved, loosened, and, in time, the war moved on to a bigger front. The very nature of results when generative systems can synthesize rather than merely link. The Google Books project aimed its crawler at shelves. The company partnered with libraries and publishers to scan millions of volumes and make them searchable. It was an archivist's dream and a lawyer's migraine. Lawsuits arrived, settlements were hammered out, and a fragile détente emerged in which snippets and discovery were fair game, while the business of selling or lending remained with rights holders. The project was awkward to explain. Google didn't want to be a bookstore, but its impact on scholarship and long-tail discovery was real. If you believe in Page's original instinct, that the structure of links contains meaning, then a book's index is a compressed promise. Books wanted to be part of the graph. In 2012, Google unveiled Glass, a slender display on a titanium frame, pitched as a step toward ambient computing. The Explorer program felt like a moonshot disguised as eyewear, dev kits for your face. Then came the backlash. Glasshole jokes, privacy anxieties, and the unsettling social signal of a camera pointed outward from a human head made the product a Rorschach blot. By 2015, the consumer experiment was paused. A quieter enterprise edition would live on in warehouses and operating rooms. If Glass was a social faux pas wrapped around a clever engineering trick, it set the table for a longer sequence. Daydream, a phone-tethered VR platform. Tango, augmented reality with depth sensors. AR Core, software-first AR. And a slow march towards head-borne displays that didn't make bystanders bristle. None lit the world on fire, yet each left a residue. APIs, sense of fusion expertise, a better sense of the boundary between wonder and weird. In the meantime, the wrist became the acceptable frontier. Android Wear evolved into Wear OS. Fitness bands turned into smartwatches. In 2019, Google announced its plan to acquire Fitbit and, after regulatory speed bumps, completed the deal in 2021. The wrist, unlike the face, delivered value without demanding that society rewrite its body language. Google's hardware story long oscillated between aspiration and allergy. The Nest acquisition in 2014 brought in Tony Fadell's team and a design-first sensibility for thermostats, cameras, and smoke detectors. The idea was obvious. If your mission is to organize information, you will eventually try to organize the home. The integration was bumpy. Cultures clashed, org charts reshuffled. But the Nest brand became the tip of the spear for Google's home strategy. In 2016, Google took a more decisive step with Pixel, a phone with Google's name on the back and Google's software agenda laced through the silicon. Over time, Pixel stopped chasing spec charts and leaned into computational tricks that felt like magic. Night sight that made the dark legible, HDR plus that produced memory-coloured photos, call screening that spared users spam. The company's own silicon, Tensor, made on-device AI more plausible, and Titan chips hardened security. Hardware, once a defensive maneuver to ensure that Google services had good hosts, became a place to show off what the stack could do when the knobs were within reach. Stadia, launched in 2019, was a gaming service that promised AAA games streamed from the cloud with no console required. Technically impressive, it ran into the and of entertainment. You need great tech and great games and great deals with publishers and great marketing and a community willing to move. Google nailed the first, struggled with the rest, and in 2023 shuttered the service. The coda was unusually graceful. Refunds were issued, and the underlying streaming tech lived on in other corners of the company. While the eyes proved tricky, the ears were receptive. Google Assistant, living in phones and then in smart speakers and Nest displays, turned the company's knowledge graph and speech prowess into a household utility. Routines chained tasks. Duplex surprised and unsettled audiences with its ability to place calls that sounded human. Over time, the voice bot faded into the fabric of the home. Timers, music, lights, while the real action moved back into the phone, where on-device models could transcribe calls in real time, summarize voicemails, and turn the camera into a tricorder for text and objects, and increasingly the world's menus. Google Cloud's adolescence was long. Enterprises cared less about elegance than about migration plans, SLAS, and salespeople who returned calls. Under Thomas Kurian, Cloud learned to speak enterprise fluently. Acquisitions like Apogee, APIs, Looker, business intelligence, and Mandiant, security, in 2022, filled out the portfolio. Anthos offered a way to run workloads across clouds, a nod to a multi-cloud reality customers preferred. BigQuery matured into a petabyte-class data warehouse that analysts could treat like a notebook. Vertex AI packaged the company's ML plumbing into a serviceable, not merely impressive set of tools. The old internal brag, "No one runs a bigger cloud than Google," finally meant something commercial. The subtler change was cultural. Cloud hired operators who prized predictability over dazzle. Roadmaps aligned with quarters, not whims. It still felt like Google. The architecture leaned on bold abstractions like Spanner and global load balancing. But it also felt like a company that could sign a 10-year deal with a bank and not wake up one morning having renamed half the services. Google's research and infrastructure teams cultivated a habit of sharing their ideas with the world in the form of papers and often code. This wasn't charity. It was a recruit and train strategy that also conveniently set industry standards. The TPU, Tensor Processing Unit program, produced custom silicon tuned for the linear algebra at the heart of neural nets. Data centers sprouted boards that looked like chess sets for matrices. TensorFlow, open sourced in 2015, gave practitioners a shared vocabulary for building models. JAX, a quieter entrant from the research world, won converts for its composability and performance on TPUS. Kubernetes, born as an open interpretation of Google's Borg, became the lingua franca of container orchestration. In a decade, nearly every back-end engineer in the world learned to speak Cube, and Google's taste in distributed systems became the industry's. Through the 2010s, Google and Facebook formed a duopoly in digital advertising. Then attention splintered. Instagram matured, and TikTok introduced a new grammar for entertainment. A full-screen feed powered by a recommendation engine with a predator's nose for novelty. YouTube, which had worn long form like a badge, learned to dance short. Shorts arrived, creators adapted, and a familiar lesson resurfaced. Platform shifts are less about devices than about habits, and the only durable competitive edge is the ability to learn faster than the culture changes. Amazon haunted Google from two angles. In search, product queries migrated straight to Amazon search bar. In cloud, AWS held a years-long lead that no elegance could erase. Voice became a curious skirmish. Alexa landed early in living rooms. Google Assistant answered with better knowledge and worse distribution. Over time, the battle cooled into coexistence. The more interesting front was commerce. Google coerced and courted merchants into feeds and surfaces, shopping campaigns, product listings, and later free listings trying to make the open web competitive with a closed mall. The outcome is still a moving target, but the direction was clear. Google's bridge between intent and transaction needed better planks. DeepMind's feats, AlphaGo in 2016, AlphaZero, StarCraft agents, protein folding breakthroughs, gave Google something you can't buy with ad revenue: scientific prestige. In 2023, Google combined Brain and DeepMind into a single unit, Google DeepMind, signalling that research and product would live closer together. The portfolio shifted from impressive papers to shipped artifacts. Models that could summarize meetings inside Workspace, tools for developers inside Cloud, and consumer features that made phones feel prescient. By 2024 to 2025, generative systems were no longer parlor tricks. Gemini arrived as a family of models tuned for text, images, and code. Search Generative Experience SGE previewed a world in which answers were synthesized, with citations and linked states preserved as you ask follow-ups. The dance was delicate. Too much synthesis and publishers howl. Too little and the assistant feels like a glorified set of blue links. Inside, teams wrestled with a riddle older than Google itself. What is the right amount of answer? The ad business adapted. Sponsored slots wrapped themselves around generative summaries. New formats promised performance without corroding trust. The bet echoed, again, a familiar instinct. Redesign the market so that what pays is also what users like. Antitrust, once a spectral threat, became a daily constraint. And the EU's fines over shopping, Android, and AdSense were big numbers with bigger implications for product defaults, bundling, and choice screens. In the US, a 2024 liability ruling on search distribution practices led, in 2025, to remedies that stopped short of breakup but forced changes in data sharing and partner contracts. Engineers, long insulated from legalese, now read remedy orders the way they once read RFCs. The habit of mind, treat constraints as APIs, proved useful. You can code against a remedy. You can A/B test a choice screen. The culture that had once fit inside a cafeteria now spanned continents and time zones. The TGIFs went hybrid. The questions got sharper. Layoffs, rare in earlier eras, arrived as macroeconomics cooled. The company tried to keep its apprenticeship model alive, code reviews as craft, design docs as literature, even as the organisation chart grew boxy. The trick of the post-founder years was to preserve taste. You could measure everything. That didn't mean you knew which risks were worth taking. Taste, it turned out, is a muscle you have to exercise in public, with launches that sometimes miss and bets that take 5 years to look obvious. By the mid-2020s, Google's set of rivals looked like a constellation rather than a mirror. Apple contested the device relationship and the privacy narrative. Amazon contested commerce and cloud. Meta contested attention. Microsoft contested AI in productivity, and with OpenAI, the frontier of model demos. Startups nibbled at every edge. The company's counter was as old as the garage. Ship faster, learn faster, make the default better. If the founder's letter at IPO time had one durable clause, it was the promise to prefer long-term bets over quarterly ease. Google didn't always live up to it, but the aspiration remained a kind of North Star you could still see faintly from the parking lot. The web that Page and Brin fell in love with was a map of human curiosity, written in blue underlines. The modern internet is messier, more appified, more closed in places, and increasingly summarized by machines. Yet the core instinct of their project has aged surprisingly well. PageRank was never just math. It was a hunch that meaning emerges from connection. The company that grew from that hunch still mostly makes its living by inferring intent from context at scale. What you meant, not merely what you typed. Even in an era of generative answers, the machine is still, in some enduring way, listening to the links. And this may be the best way to read Google's story to date, not as a march from garage to megacap, but as a sequence of reframings of the same question. If the world is made of signals, how much can you infer from the patterns among them? The crawler that became a company is still crawling across documents and maps and proteins and pixels, and now, increasingly, across our words. The question may never be finished. That is the point.